Target isolation is really important in just about every type of guerrilla warfare style PvP. When it comes to anti-interceptor frigate tactics, it's crucial. It's not just important, it's the most important thing that you'll learn. Um, in order to be successful flying anti-interceptor, you can't take on entire blobs all at the same time. You have to separate off the weak targets, the squishy targets, and take those down first before you can take on anything else. And ideally, if there's a blob that say has 4 interceptors, you want to shape the battle space or shape the grid in such a way so that you can drop 1 interceptor at a time, and whether that's in rapid succession or in a long running series of battles, you want to drop the targets 1 at a time and never take on more than 1 ship at a time if you can help it. Sometimes you're not going to be able to help it, and your small size will help you there because the bigger ships won't be able to hit you very easily as long as you stay moving. That's crucial. A lot of my tactics say that you should approach. Problem with approaching is if there's a blob shooting at you from range, you're going to be a perfect target. So if you're engaging in a blob and you're also taking fire from a blob that's say 70k away or whatever, you want to orbit at 500 in that case. If it's just you and your target, you want to just approach and get in as close as you can and try to drop them as fast as you can. But should you be taking fire, you want to make sure you orbit at 500 and keep up a little bit of transversal velocity to reduce the amount of incoming DPS you're taking. So in this video, we're going to talk about some of the basic techniques you can use to isolate your targets. Now, these aren't the only ways to isolate your targets by any means. There's more ways than I can even think of. I mean, it's all situational. Sometimes you can use gates to isolate targets. Sometimes you can use distance to isolate targets. Sometimes you can use planets to isolate targets and warping. There's all kinds of different ways you can isolate targets. You can use bubbles to isolate targets. It's just, there's a lot more to it, and I can't cover it all here. But once you know the basics of target isolation, the rest of it will become a lot more easy. So let's get started with some of the most basic target isolation methods. All right, the most basic target isolation is the 100k isolation. Now, excuse the artwork. I'm not the best artist, and certainly not the best graphic artist, I guess. So some of these graphics are a little bit basic, but they give you the idea. The 100k isolation is where you try to isolate your target 100k from the blob. Now, because you're hunting fast interceptors, 100k is no big deal for an interceptor. But the blob is most likely going to consist of bigger ships, cruisers, battleships, maybe the occasional hack. Hacks are a little bit faster than the others. But in that case, you know, you're looking at 1,000, 1,500, maybe 2,000 max is going to be the top speed that they're going to be able to put out to get to you. And even at 2,000 meters a second, it's going to take the blob, or whatever ship that's going that fast from the blob, it's going to take them 50 seconds to cover 100k. So you see, if you have a target isolated 100k, you almost have them, you know, completely helpless from the rest of the blob. And it depends on the composition of the blob also, so you got to take that into account. But the more you do it, the more you're able to spot the danger signs, you know, and look out for what the problems are going to be. It's all experience, and everything in PvP is experience, but knowing some basics, you know, is what I'm doing. I'm going to accelerate your learning curve with this type of stuff. And instead of it taking you 2-3 years to learn it like it did me, you'll be able to learn it in just a couple months because you'll know all the little tricks. So here we are, the first isolation, 100k. You see, we got the blob, we got a line, we got the target, 100k. It's that simple. You have the target 100k away from the rest of the blob. That's it. How do you do this? Well, you warp to a gate where there's a blob, make sure there's no bubble, and you warp in at 100k, and you let the interceptors come out to you. You slow a line away from the blob because you really want to be between 100 and 120. 130 maybe. 140 you're pushing it because then they can back away from you and then warp to you. The reason for the 100k is the minimum warp distance is 150k. So as long as you're less than that from them, they cannot warp to you. So you want to make sure you keep that 100 and really 130 or 130 or less. So between 100 and 130, I'd say, is a good way to go. If you go above that, then they may have a smart pilot who will actually move away from you and then warp in on you. Or your fight may, since it's high speed, your fight could spiral outside that 150k range, and then you start getting warp ins on you. So aim for that range. That's the reason for the range, is you want to make it so it's as long as possible for them to micro warp drive, for them to slow boat out to you with their regular ship, propulsion, whatever, and you want to make it impossible for them to warp to you. So it's that little sweet spot right there. And you do that, like I said, warp in at 100k from the blob, try to draw their tacklers off the blob. There's other ways to do it, like, I guess it's on a station. You can do the same thing, 100k. I mean, that's, if you see me out in an anti-interceptor ship, you're going to see me probably 80% of the time just loitering about 100k away from the blob, and just doing whatever I can to make myself look like an easy target while still maintaining that level of isolation. Alright, our next type of isolation is a little bit more advanced, and it's a little bit more rare, but when you can pull it off, they never expect it, and I really enjoy this one. I actually learned about this when I saw someone do it in a PvP video. They were in a hurricane. I forget the guy's name. He's pretty well known, but he was in a hurricane, Nanocane, and he was micro warp driving away out of a belt in low sec, and he had a blob in low sec chasing him. And as the blob chased him, he was dropping the targets as they were coming in. So he just stayed aligned out and popped them as they were coming at him, which is a great tactic. But what he did that I thought was really cool was there was a lone stealth bomber at the belt at 0. And he was like looting a wreck or something. He was by himself. The rest of the blob was chasing him. But you see, the unique situation here was that he was like probably 200-300k from the belt, from the actual warp in of the belt, and the enemy blob was probably right around 100, 150 or something. Maybe not where they could warp back, and certainly not aligned to it. So what he did was he cut his micro warp drive, turned back in, and warped back to the belt at 0. He landed at 0 and popped to the target, the stealth bomber, because you can, they're really, really squishy, really, really easy to kill. He dropped that, got aligned out, repeated the process, and eventually warped away safely. But he was able to get a really easy kill there because the blob didn't really pay attention to where he could warp. And so you always have to be cautious of that. I've done that as well. I was in a what was I in? I think I was either in a Vagabond or a Hurricane, and there was a blob chasing me in 0-0, and we were at a I forget. I think it was a Sino, and there was a like a heavy armor tanked air zoo out in the middle of space, lighting a Sino, and I warped the Sino at range, got them to chase me. I popped a couple of their targets as they were coming at me. Actually, it was a covert Sino. That's what it was, a covert Sino from an air zoo, and the air zoo popped the Sino to try to attack someone else. I forget. Obviously, I'm telling a really bad story here. I forget exactly what happened, but I lined out. There's a bunch of stealth bombers and recons that were chasing me. I dropped a couple stealth bombers as I was running away, and then I warped back to the air zoo, which I think had lit a traditional Sino. That's what it was. He didn't have a covert Sino. The air zoo lit a traditional Sino to bring in the Black Ops fleet. All right, so now we got the right story. Oops. So he lit the regular Sino. He was stuck there for 10 minutes. So I drawed all his buddies off, killed some of their stealth bombers, and then I turned around and I went back in on him and warped back to that Sino at 0. He was isolated from his buddies. His buddies couldn't do anything to help him. So I just went to work on him, overloaded my guns. His buddies were like 100, 120k off of him from where they were chasing me. And I had actually planned that from the beginning. I knew I was going to get these guys. They had surprised me before, I think, or one of my buddies. Actually, it was one of my buddies, one of the guys in my alliance. And they had hot dropped him with a little trap. And so I wanted to go get some revenge, and I went in there and I warped back on him. I was taking him out. He had a lot of tank. I wasn't able to drop him. I got him down into deep armor before his blob started coming in, and I had to go back out. But then as his blob came back, they still had the same weak recon and stealth bomber fleet. I was able to drop a couple more of their stealth bombers. So This tactic, it's not the same every time, but it's basically you want to find warpables on the grid. And if you look at the graphic, now the graphic there kind of tells a different story. But this one goes back to a fight I had probably a week from recording this, a week ago before I recorded this. And in that fight, I was in 0-0, and I was in a Fed Navy Comet, and it was a rail Fed Navy Comet, which I'm kind of experimenting with lately. But I had drawn off the blob, and I had all of their fast ships chasing me. And all of their fast ships had chased me away from the planet's warp in. Actually, I think it was a customs office at the planet. And so we were moving away from that, and as we moved away, I popped their Ares, and then I kept moving, and their blob was still chasing, but they had a crow that was sitting still. He was just sitting there doing nothing at the. And I got this on video too. He was sitting still at the warp end, just sitting there. I guess he had given up and didn't even want to try to chase, and he wasn't thinking that I would turn around and warp back in. So I warped across his blob, landed back at 0 on the warp end, and was able to drop him. Unfortunately, the other interceptors in the fleet were able to lock me down before I could get out. I should have gotten out. I made a mistake and missed my point for the first couple seconds. Otherwise, I would have gotten him and got out as well. But I ended up taking out the 2 interceptors from their blob. It was a lot of fun, and that's a good isolation tactic. Just move, and if you can't move the tackler off the blob, move the blob off the tackler, or move the blob off the target. So that's basically that tactic. Alright, this last, actually it's not the last isolation. I'm going to do another one. It's the last illustration. It's the last fancy artwork I did, because the other one I'm going to talk about is not quite as easy to draw out. But what you can see here is triangles are targets you don't want to fight. The rectangle, gray rectangle, that's your target. The little circle, the yellow circle, that's you. And the blue circle is the gate. The line is separating 2 systems, one system to the left, one system to the right. Now we're going to talk about how to use the gate to isolate targets. This is going to take advantage of the aggro timer, not the session timer, the aggro timer. And you're going to make use of the aggro. You can use the session change timer to separate targets somewhat. But since it's a much shorter timer and getting shorter all the time, it's not nearly as good as a way to isolate targets as perhaps an aggro is, because an aggro is a full minute. If they were to aggro you, then they get aggro timer for a full minute. So what you're going to do here is we're going to come up with a little example scenario. The example scenario would be if on the left side of the gate you had 2 assault ships, 2 interceptors, and a saber. Okay, nothing on the other side. So what you would do is you'd orbit the gate at 500. Now what that saber is going to try to do is, if he's a double bubble saber, which means he has 2 bubble launchers fitted, then he's going to try to bubble one side, jump, bubble the other side, and to try to lock you down. It doesn't really matter if he does, but if he pops the bubble and doesn't jump, what you need to do while you're orbiting at 500 is attempt to warp to something else. You're not going to be able to, but just attempt to click the actual warp, and it'll tell you can't. But what that does by doing that is that will aggro him and make it so that he cannot jump through that gate for 1 minute. So what you're going to do then is, whether he jumps or not, it doesn't really matter. You're an interceptor, you're faster than him. Don't really worry too much, although some sabers are pretty quick. What you need to do is try to get them aggroed. And sometimes I would do this in the Dremel, and I'd aggro them on each side of the gate. And I would jump back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, until I got the perfect aggro to isolate my target. But what you're going to do is you're going to attempt, let's say you get 2 assault ships, 1 interceptor to aggro you on the left side of the gate. You jump through, and the saber and another interceptor follows you. You're anti-interceptor. You want to kill that interceptor, and you've now isolated that interceptor on the other side of the gate. But the saber's still there, and you can't fight under the fire of a saber. So what do? Well, what you do is you find something that's away from the gate. Don't run back over the gate, because then you're going to run right through their point range, and they might web you or scram you. Find something away from the gate, so you'll have the gate to your back, the back of your ship, and hit align micro warp drive, and then start running away from the gate. It's even better if the saber bubbles at this point, because then it's going to look like you're trying to run out of the bubble. it's going to play possum, as I say sometimes. You're going to be pretending to be the scared little ship that's running away. And that's what you want. You want your enemy to think he has the upper hand for as long as possible before you turn it around on him. I do that in all my PvP. I try to pretend to be weak until the last second, and then I'll turn things on them whenever possible, because that tactic tends to work very well. But what you would do is you would align out away from the gate, hit your micro warp drive, and then just take off. And what's going to happen is that interceptor is going to start chasing. The Saber will chase as well, but if you give some heat to your micro warp drive for one cycle, you should be able to isolate from the Saber within the first, I'd say, 20 seconds of the fight. You should be able to get a good 70 to 100k isolation from the Saber before you turn back in on the interceptor. And the interceptor is going to be able to keep up with you. The Saber's going to go maybe 3k. He might overload and go 4k. Maybe more. Some Sabers go faster. But nonetheless, you're going to isolate the interceptor. Turn back in, drop him really fast, and then have something selected to align to, and just warp out. Boom. You've got your target. You've isolated him. You've both used the gate as an isolation and distance as an isolation, because now when all those guys jump in from the other side, once their aggro ends, if you haven't finished your fight, they can't warp to you. Ideally, if you're less than 150 from the gate, they won't be able to warp to you. So you have isolation in two different ways on your target. Now, a more vanilla basic gate isolation for you would be if you have just two combat interceptors. Let's say you have two Tyrannuses and you're in a claw. All right, and the two Tyrannuses are chasing you. They land on the gate at the same time as you. You draw aggro from one, then jump through. Make them think you're running away and you're weak. Even better if you're in a Raptor, then that's even better. Make them think you're running. You jump through once you have aggro from only one. The other one doesn't realize his buddy's aggroed. He jumps through. He tries to tackle you on the other side. You have a whole minute on the other side of the gate to have your way with that other Tyrannus before his buddy can jump in. And by that time, you've either won and gotten out, or you've won and you're sitting there waiting on the other guy because you're going to drop him too as well. So it's a great tactic for isolating targets. Just look for your opportunities. All right, our final types of isolation will be warp isolation and bubble traps. All right. Warp isolation, when you're in an anti-interceptor interceptor, takes advantage of the fact that your interceptor warps faster. I believe it's about 2 to 3 times faster, depending on the interceptor you're in, because the tackle interceptors warp faster than the combat version of the interceptors. You have to look at the stats. But I believe that one's 6 AU a second, the other one's 9 AU a second. So different interceptors will do better than others in this type of isolation. But the warp isolation is basically, if you ever have a long warp across system, let's say you have a blob chasing you. You're an interceptor, and there's a blob of 20 guys chasing you. They have a couple interceptors in their blob. You warp gate to gate, 100 AU, okay? 100 AU gate to gate, and you cross that distance at, let's say, for this example, let's say 9 AU a second. That's going to take you about 11 seconds plus the time to speed up, slow down, about 13 seconds to cross it, 13 to 15 seconds to cross that distance. Okay, it's probably more than that, but just for conversation's sake here. So the next thing is the blob, they all warp at 3 AU a second. So it's going to take them 3 times faster to cover that distance. It's going to take them 3 times faster. Okay, so about like 30 to 45 seconds to cover that same distance. That gives you a time difference of like 30 seconds there. So for 30 seconds, you've got the target. You're going to be on the other side alone before they arrive, at least. Now, if they have interceptors in their fleet, they will warp as fast as you do. So, in effect, you're going to have their interceptors come out of warp 30 seconds before the blob comes out of warp. Now, this one's hard to pull off, but you can get it to pull off, and this is just the most basic way to do it, is in one warp. We're going to talk more about it in a second. So in that single warp, you've got 30 seconds. If you're in a high DPS ship like a Tyrannus, good chance they come out of warp at 0. They'll tackle you thinking their blob's going to be there any second. you can drop them and then warp out before the blob arrives, because you've got 30 seconds. Let's say they're in a tackle Ares. You're going to be able to drop them easily within 10 seconds, 15 max, and then just warp off before the blob arrives. Be careful if they have interdictors, because interdictors warp at like 6 AU a second or something like that. So those will get there a little bit sooner than the rest of the blob as well, and you can also isolate those. The way to take that a step further, which is something I've actually been practicing and I'm still not great at, I've done it a couple times, but it takes some work, is get them to warp multiple times. Like I said, I'm not a pro at this, so I can't teach you exactly how to do it as good as I would really like. But what I would do is I would get a line to a planet and have a blob chase me, and then that planet would ideally be as far away as possible, as many AU as possible. And then I would have that blob, I would warp to that planet at 0, or maybe at 100, doesn't really matter, and I would have that whole blob chase me. And then I would lower my directional scanner, and I would look and see which ones are coming and as they come. And if I can see that it's just their tacklers on scan, and they stay on scan for a few seconds before the rest of them show up, I may just engage right there at the planet, or I may align off the planet's 0 and draw them 100K from that 0 on the planet to engage. Or what I may do is I may then wait for them to see me and then warp to something else that's obvious, and then fight them at that spot, because basically all those big ships are going to have to land at 0 or 100 or wherever on the planet that you warp to the first time. Then they're going to have to get aligned, which takes time, and then warp across to the next spot. So you have multiple warps and the longer align times that you're exploiting that time to increase the time of the bigger ships, while you know that the smaller ships are faster, and that gives you a time isolation, not so much a distance isolation, but a time isolation, which is effective. The final type of isolation, and this one requires some creativity, is bubble isolations, bubble traps. To do those, ideally, you need to pre-plan it. You need to have, know that there's a bubble drag in that warp, and then basically warp to a tactical safe spot just off the gate. So if you're warping gate to gate, have the blob chase you and warp to a tactical just off the gate, so the rest of the blob gets drawn into the bubble, and then their tacklers would come out at you. It's not the same as the other ones. Mostly that's like a sniper tactic, is you would set a bubble at 0 on a planet, and then you'd set up a tactical like 100K at an angle off that, so you would then draw them to warp to the planet to chase you, and then your sniper fleet would be sitting 100K away from that bubble they all got dragged into, and you would be able to pick them off while they're sitting in that bubble. That's a tactic that I came up with a while back. But you can use bubbles in certain cases, and it's hard for me to think of some right this second. But you can definitely use bubbles to isolate your targets as well. So that's it for target isolation. That's by no means all you need to know. That's just the basics. That gives you some ideas of the different types of isolations. There's aggro isolations, there's distance isolations, and there's time isolations. All of those have the same effect. They give you the chance to take on just your target without having to fight the blob. It's the guerrilla tactics, and it's what makes anti-interceptor so fun, for me at least. So good luck, get out there and try it out, and just keep trying and take some risks, try different things, and the more you do it, the better you'll get at it.